Good afternoon to all of us on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you Central, Mountain, and Pacific time and elsewhere. Thank you for joining us for this event today, hosted by the R Street Institute that we are calling Advice and Consent, the Senate in Trump's second term. My name is Matt Germer. I am the director of the governance program at the R Street Institute, and I'm delighted to moderate this conversation today. As a reminder for our attendees, this event is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel there and be aware when the video is posted. By way of introduction, I wanted to welcome our guests today, James Wallner and Ed Whelan, who will be talking about their insights on a range of issues, particularly the extent of presidential power in appointing executive officers, the president's ability to force Congress into a recess, and the Senate's overall role on confirmation and what we should expect as we watch the new Trump administration take their new roles. This discussion is particularly timely, not only because of the upcoming change in the administration and in the composition of Congress, but also because we know that this year, almost more than most, we've been seeing major news immediately after the election about who might fill these vacancies in the next Trump administration and the process by which those vacancies will be filled. I'd like to do a brief introduction of our distinguished speakers today. First, we have Ed Whelan, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he holds the prestigious Antonin Scalia Chair in Constitutional Studies. He's a leading commentator on judicial nominations and on constitutional law. He's known for the Bench Memos blog at National Review. He also authors the Confirmation Tales newsletter, where he pulls from his extensive experience in judicial confirmation battles. He helps direct the Ethics and Public Policy Center's program on the Constitution, the courts, and the culture. And he's been featured across a number of prominent newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I think maybe important for the purposes of our discussion today is to recognize that Ed has held significant positions in all three branches of government, whether it's clerking for Justice Scalia or for Judge Wallace on the Ninth Circuit, functioning as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel within the DOJ, or functioning as the General Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary. Hopefully all of that rich background will help provide for really fascinating insights and discussion today. Joining us in addition to Ed is James Wallner, who is a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, where he focuses on the theory and practice of democratic politics. And in particular, this includes separation of powers, Congress, political parties, and federal policy processes. He's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Clemson. And prior to joining R Street, he functioned as the vice president for research at the Heritage Foundation and has extensive experience on Capitol Hill, perhaps most notably for this conversation today, functioning as the executive director of the Senate Steering Committee under the leadership of Pat Toomey and Mike Lee. James has also written a number of books about the United States Senate, and he's been featured in publications and journals across the country. So thank you to Ed, thank you to James for joining us today. I'm wondering if maybe we can get started. We'll turn to you first, Ed. If you can walk us through the basics of where we are in the cabinet appointment process. Why are we seeing so much of this in the news?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Matt, for having me. Well, let's start with a couple dates. January 20th, obviously, is when Donald Trump will be inaugurated as president. January 3rd is when the new Senate reconvenes. So what we're looking at now is the process by which Donald Trump prepares to get his cabinet picks confirmed and running as soon as he can. And what he can do is get all the paperwork done on these nominees, get everything ready so that the relevant Senate committees to which the nominations are referred can conduct their hearings in advance of January 20th. This is routinely done, and what this could mean ideally is that as soon as Donald Trump nominates these folks on January 20th, they could promptly be confirmed by the Senate. So this process right now, we have Donald Trump announcing his picks. There ought to be a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't see. It involves filling out the different questionnaires that the committees of jurisdiction have, their demands for information from the prospective nominees. Includes ought to include, at least this is an issue, FBI background checks, both for the future administration's sake, but also for the Senate in carrying out its role. Now, why has this been so much in the news? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, in part, it's always of interest whom an incoming president will select for cabinet positions. But I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump has made this higher profile um, in a few ways. One, he has made some unconventional picks. He is, in many ways, celebrated as unconventional president. And unconventional picks, like his initial pick to be Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, since withdrawn, have naturally drawn a lot of attention. These picks give clues as to what he might aim to do early in his administration. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about so-called payback. This is where the Department of Justice would come into play specifically. Donald Trump has complained about being the target of criminal investigations by DOJ, and he has indicated he may go aggressively after those who prosecuted him. So that explains a particular interest in DOJ. There's also been talk by the president-elect himself and by many around him about trying to bypass the Senate's ordinary advice and consent process for cabinet officials, other nominations. And this got a lot of attention a couple weeks ago. Donald Trump seems to have indicated he doesn't have any interest in it, but it could be resurrected. And this would really be a dramatic and I think dangerous change in how the Senate operates. We can talk about this more as we go forward, but that's an overview of why this is in the news.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think you touched on something in particular here, which is that this is the kind of process that requires multiple branches of government working together in sync to make these appointments happen, as that Senate seems to have its role of advice and consent. I'll turn to James now for a bit of a follow-up on this topic. I'm curious if you can add a little more color about the Senate's role in this process. How much time should it all take? Are we seeing this fast-tracked in some way, or is this all pretty standard in the history of Senate confirmations?
Well, thank you, Matt, for having this, and thank you, Ed, for joining us. This is a really important discussion. I think, look, at the end of the day, I think it's the Senate has a role, and I think we often forget that. We think that the Senate's role is to, in essence, rubber stamp the president's nominees, whether they be judicial nominees or executive branch officials. But the Constitution is clear. The advice and consent power of the Senate is an independent role that the Senate has to confirm federal officials, including cabinet officials. And the Senate can decide how it wants to exercise that power. The Constitution also gives the Senate, and the House for that matter, the ability to determine how they conduct their proceedings. Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2. No other part of the federal government has that power. Congress does, and only Congress can decide how it will use its power under the Constitution. So the Senate has an independent role in the confirmation process. They ought to defer to the president. They ought not to, but that's ultimately up to the senators themselves, and then by extension, their voters, their constituents. Of course, the president does have an ability, as Ed has alluded to make what we call a recess appointment to kind of bypass the Senate. But you're bypassing the Senate for a temporary period of time when the Senate's not around. That's why we have the recess appointment power. So I think it's really important to remember that the Senate does have a role, and that role is an independent role, separate and apart from the executive branch.
So I'm curious then, James, to follow up on that. We're having this conversation about what to expect out of the next Trump administration, the way that he will work with Republicans in the Senate. But my memory is that this isn't the first time Trump has been president, and this isn't the first time Trump's been president with Republicans running the Senate. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happened when it came to cabinet appointments and presidential appointments in the last Trump administration? And do we expect this time around to be different? And if so, why? What's really changed from 2017, January of 2017 to January of 2025?
Nothing has really changed other than the fact that I may have, less hair, I think, and maybe a little bit more gray in my beard. We have unified control of Congress. Maybe the margins are a little bit narrower in the House, of course, but the House doesn't really come into play here. We have President-elect Donald Trump, soon to be President Trump. And like all presidents, when they come into office, they're going to front load the calendar with their nominees because they need to stand up their administration. So that's going to be really front and center. The last time this happened, there was a lot of frustration on the part of Donald Trump with the pace of the confirmation process. That ultimately led to Republicans changing or at least ignoring the cloture rule, the part of the cloture rule that says that after you into filibuster on a nominee, you have up to 30 hours of debate. Well, they shortened that because the president-elect was very frustrated, as he was when he was president. So I think a lot of the frustration we see now, the anticipated frustration, can be traced back to that. But also, it's not just on Democrats, right? Republicans like to blame Democrats for the delay, but Republicans and how they manage the institution, how they structured the time that has to run under the rules to run overnight and over the weekend, basically working with Democrats to delay a process that they could otherwise kind of jumpstart and get going, I think is also important to keep in mind. And so when the president or the president's supporters are upset with Democrats in the Senate back and then, or maybe next year, I think it's also important to look at what Republicans are doing and what they're doing, because there's plenty of tools at their disposal to put pressure on the other side or the opponents of the president's nominees to ultimately force votes. And then at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the Senate to decide when they have those votes, whether or not those nominees ought to be confirmed.
So that's an interesting framing that you use there, too, of recognizing that there will be opponents to President Trump's nominees. Ed, I want to turn to you with kind of a similar question to what I offered to James around what's changed between this time and now. It's my observation as, I follow Hill news like this. I try to stay aware of what's going on, but I'm not as deeply connected as the two of you in the goings-on of the Senate and the history of our country's interactions on this front. But it seems to me that opponents to some of the presidential nominees are not just among Democrats, that some of them might be among Republicans. And I'm curious if you have some thoughts as to whether there's a difference in approach from the Trump team, transition team in this term, and what looks a little different on this 2025 administration.
Let me first go back to 2017, because I think some of the complaints one hears from Team Trump are exaggerated. Back in 2017, you had two cabinet picks, major departments, Defense and Department of Homeland Security, confirmed on Inauguration Day, January 20th. You had 7 others confirmed between January 31st and mid-February. Now, things could be faster, but frankly, it's impossible to know whether the delays are because paperwork wasn't gotten to the committees in time, whether there are other problems going on. In one case, you had a nomination withdrawn. So I would be hesitant to conclude that that one party or another was responsible for the delays. Again, looks like all of the major cabinet officers were in place by mid-February. And importantly, even before that happens, President Trump will have the opportunity to get people he trusts in place. There's a very important law that was enacted in 1998, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, that gives the president lots of flexibility to name as acting officers folks who he doesn't have to pursue confirmation for. These folks can actually run the office, exercise the full authority of the head of the department as acting officers. This is not recess appointment. This is an alternative to that. I'd also emphasize that Donald Trump has 2 large advantages. Now, he had these back in 2017, but no other president has had these. One is he has a sizable majority in the Senate, along with the abolition of the filibuster for executive branch nominees. That happened back in November 2013. So there's a lot of room for him to get folks confirmed promptly if his administration acts competently and hits the ground running with hearings in early January.
So then I am a little curious. We're having so much of this discussion about how quickly some of these nominees will run through. The sense is that there's both an implication of that maybe the nominees themselves might warrant additional time of consideration from members of the Senate. I don't know whether or not there is actual plans to have slower confirmations than we saw in 2017, but just to help set the stage for what could be on the horizon for some of this. Ed, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the process of confirmation and where things might slow down. What could senators do to delay confirmations, even if it's unlikely that they do so, since there should be substantial alignment between the Senate majority and the president, just given the partisan nature of the two branches. But I'm curious if you can walk through for our viewers, what could senators do and what are those limits?
Sure. So first of all, again, the committees with jurisdiction over the nominees can hold hearings even before Donald Trump becomes president. First week of January is a common time to have hearings held. In order for that to happen, though, all the paperwork needs to be done. The background investigation needs to be complete. There needs to be some coordination with the chairman of the committee. I have no idea. I don't think anyone has any idea where things stand right now with the existing prospective nominees. So what you could have happen is you could have those hearings take place. You could have Donald Trump become president on January 20th. You could have, this is the fast track, you could have him nominate them right away. You could have the Senate confirm them right away. But you asked about opportunities for slowdown. So first of all, again, there's this referral of the nomination to the committee, say for the Attorney General, to the Judiciary Committee. I'm more familiar with the Judiciary Committee than I am with other committees. I'll use it as an illustration, but I think there are similar procedures with other committees. The Judiciary Committee will hold its hearing on the Attorney General and will then vote to report that nomination to the Senate floor. Now, under the Judiciary Committee's rules, any senator on the committee can have the matter held over for at least a week. So there's a delay right there of a week. Now, again, if you get your hearing done early enough, that week could run before January 20th. Then when the nomination gets to the floor, we have had the abolition of the filibuster, that is the abolition of the supermajority cloture rule of 60 senators needed to get to a final vote. There still, though, is a cloture process. And the opponents of a nomination could insist we need to have this cloture vote. And more importantly, even if that cloture vote succeeds, James referred to the reform of the 2-hour rule that was adopted back in early 2019. That rule applies to sub-cabinet officials. It doesn't apply to cabinet officers. So opponents of the nomination could tie up the Senate floor for 30 hours on every nominee. Floor time gets scarce. That presents a real challenge. How do you prioritize these nominees? How do you move past this delay? But I would say that that ability to use post-cloture debate time is one of the tools for blocking things. But again, beyond that, if the administration doesn't do its paperwork properly, you're not going to have a hearing as soon as you can, and that could be a big source of delay.
One thing I want to ask, and I'll turn to James. I'll give you the first crack at it, but I guess you could feel free to punt it to Ed, depending on your comfort. But I am curious if you have some light that you can share or shed on what happens if there is a delay. Who actually functions in these roles of cabinet officials? Are they holdovers from the Biden administration? Are they people that Trump's team are able to put in temporarily while they're waiting for these nominations? I think this might be an important thing for folks to have in mind if we're hearing that there either are delays or a need for rushing things through, what the implications would be in the meantime.
Yeah, well, I think first, just to go back to your question to Ed and the procedures. Look, I mean, in many respects, this is a problem that doesn't exist, right? And it didn't exist. I think I agree with Ed in 2017 to the degree that I think people may think it existed. The president certainly felt that there was a delay happening, and to the extent that there was a delay, it happened with regard to that floor stage, not necessarily the committee stage. I mean, it happened with regard to both executive branch officials and then also throughout 2017 and 18 with judges, where basically Republicans were working with Democrats to make it as easy as possible to consume up to 30 hours. look, there are some real considerations. One, you can't have a vote in the Judiciary Committee on an Attorney General nominee until that nominee is submitted. That nominee can't be submitted until January 20th, when the president can submit the nominee, right? So that formal part can't happen. But that is absolutely correct that the hearings can happen before that, because the hearings are just for the Senate. It's just a way for the Senate to decide, are they doing their due diligence? But then under their rules, once they receive that nomination from the president, which has to be after the 20th, then yes, at that point, any senator could hold over the nominee for a week, right? But that's just with regard to the Judiciary Committee. Not all committees have that provision, and you can always change the rules in the committee with a majority vote. And last time I checked, the Republicans have a majority in the committee. So you can get there, and then when you're on the floor, yes, it takes up to 30 hours for a cabinet level nominee. But I would just, caution this. It's not a floor, it's a ceiling. You have to consume the time. And in 2017, what was happening was that Republicans were working with Democrats to make it easy to consume the time, right? Chuck Schumer would say, hey, I ask unanimous consent that let's not stay here all night and talk about this. We just want to have this vote 30 hours from now. And then they'd say, okay. Or if it was a Thursday, they'd say, ask unanimous consent to have the vote on a Monday, well past the 30 hours. And Republicans would agree, instead of forcing Democrats to stick around and actually delay the nominees, right? And so in that sense, yes, there was cooperation that delayed the nominees, and that was frustrating, I think, to the new administration. But with regard to the ability of a minority or any senator to push back within the confines of the rules, I often point out that we forget effort. We forget that these are people, right? And Chris Murphy, a senator, a Democratic senator, was at an event of I think Washington Post. I forget who had the event. It was in February of 2017. Mitch McConnell had just forced the Senate to go through an all-night session. I think it was over Jeff Sessions, his nomination to be the Attorney General. I could be wrong on that, but it was one of the cabinet nominees. And the crowd was very excited. They're like, this is great. We're going to take the fight to the president. We're going to really resist. This is the beginning of the resistance. This is the beginning of the change. And Murphy says, I'm exhausted. I don't think I can keep this up. And it was one night, right? And so I think it's important to remember that, one, it's really hard to push back. And then two, yes, floor time is scarce, but it's not scarce in January. It's not scarce in February, because the new administration is just getting started. The committees are just getting stood up, and they have been consumed with nominations. There is one thing the Senate does in January and February, and that is vote on nominees every 4 years. That's just the fact of the matter. Maybe not if it's you just reelected a president, but when a new administration comes in, that's what you're doing. They're not going to be doing NDAA. They're not going to be doing appropriations. They're not going to be doing all these other things. They're going to be doing nominees. So, I think within the confines of the rules, the president has all the tools he needs to kind of get his team in place if and only if he has the votes in the Senate.
Thanks. That is helpful. And I do want to make sure, again, for context, who ends up filling these roles in the interim between the moment when perhaps Trump takes office and is inaugurated and ultimately when the nominations are accepted?
Well, I'll defer to Ed on that, but I will say we have a civil service, and then we have the kind of political appointees who come in and work with the civil service. Yeah. We also have a transition process, and that transition process starts, with the conventions, right before the conventions. And then once you have a presumptive nominee, you have these things called landing teams. They go in and they work with the administration to ensure a smooth handoff. And then you have your policy teams kind of come in, and then they kind of take over. And then, as Ed points out, you have all sorts of different things to happen. And I'll defer to him on the kind of granular specifics. But I will say that there are very well-established procedures in place to ensure that the business of government keeps going while we have these very minor kind of gaps and kind of who's going to be in the cabinet. But yeah, I would defer to Ed on that.
Yeah, well, there are laws and department rules that govern who becomes an acting officer in a position when that position is vacant. So there's a default rules that would apply, but there also is the authority of the president under this Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 to name someone else other than the default person as the acting head. This is a complicated statute. I don't have it in front of me right now. Even if I did, I might misstate it. But I believe at the outset, the president can select anyone. Let's use DOJ as an example. Anyone in DOJ at a certain level who has served in that department for the last 180 days. Well, you can criticize DOJ as much as you want for its left-wing bias, but be assured that you can find some very conservative attorneys who easily meet that requirement. Presumably, the Trump administration has spotted them already and is ready to put someone in as acting AG from day one, if that is Pam Bondi isn't promptly confirmed on day one. So that's an example, and it's a lot of work to identify these folks, but the essential point is that there are, thanks to this Vacancies Reform Act, alternatives to putting appointed officials in right away. You have these acting officers who can function.
That's really helpful. So at least my takeaway from this is it's not as if we are entirely rudderless in the event that there's a delay. There is someone stepping into that role. That person is largely identified, depending on perhaps on the department and the specifics, but identified by the president and his team to help fill in that capacity until his specific nominee is able to step forward. I guess, Ed, if we can kind of continue on this theme, maybe we'll get to the real meat and potatoes of the media discussion around this, which has been this idea that's floated of using recess appointments to try to fill these vacancies. Can you walk through what do people mean by that, and why is this in the news? Why is this something that's really being talked about? Is it actually going to help Trump put his people in? Is it meant to overcome specific delays in the Senate? Kind of help set the stage for us on that.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, I believe, where the Appointments Clause is located. This is a fundamental feature of the Constitution, an essential check that the framers gave to the Senate on the president's ability to name his top officers. Hamilton spells this out very clearly in, I believe, Federalist 78, maybe 76. This authority. So the ordinary process is the president makes a nomination, the Senate exercises its advice and consent role. If it confirms the nomination, the president may then appoint that person, and that person may take office. And as Hamilton emphasizes, this check, this Senate role, helps to ensure that the president doesn't put in cronies or people whose only qualification is how obsequious they are. He has a colorful line to that effect. And it's a core Senate function, and especially important with respect to cabinet officers. Now, what some have close to Trump have proposed, and what he himself seems to have tweeted about at some point, is a prospect of trying to use the backup recess appointment authority as a means to do a blanket appointment of cabinet officers. Now, immediately following the Appointments Clause in the Constitution is this recess appointments provision that says that the president has this supplemental authority when the Senate is in recess to fill offices that may happen to be vacant during that recess. The concern was that there could be a real need to have someone exercising that authority, and that's why this authority exists. So this is a backup supplemental method. It's intended to be secondary and to be used only in certain circumstances. What you have here is some in the Trump team seeming ready to flip the Constitution on its head to eviscerate the Senate's core power of advice and consent. And I think it would be incredibly damaging to the Senate as an institution. What's more, the question is, how would they go about doing this? Well, one way that would be lawful but deeply anti-constitutional would be for the Senate itself to go into recess on January 20th. Basically say, we're giving up our powers. We are castrating ourselves. We're enabling the president to install everyone he wants for the time that the recess appointment exists, which is until the end of the next term. So basically, it'll be until late 2026. Another means that folks on his team seem to be exploring is a means that I think is both outrageous and unconstitutional. And this would purport to use the president's authority under, I believe it's Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, to adjourn both houses in the event of a disagreement between the houses as to when they'll adjourn. So the notion here would be that the House would pass some sort of resolution of adjournment of both houses. The Senate would say, we don't want to adjourn, or the Senate might simply not act. And President Trump would say, aha, we have a disagreement. I'm ordering both houses to adjourn. I think it would be, again, outrageous for the House to participate in an evisceration of the Senate's confirmation authority. But beyond that, I think it's clear that the Constitution gives each House the authority only to object to the other houses going out of session, not to it staying in session. So the Constitution provides in Article 1 that no House can adjourn for more than 3 days, I think it is, without the consent of the other. So if a House is going to wants to adjourn for longer than that, it needs the other House's consent. There's no provision that's saying that a House needs the other House's consent to stay in business, to stay in session. So I think that the House's disagreement with the Senate's intention to stay in session is as constitutionally irrelevant as my agreement or disagreement with that. So I think this would just be, it would be an unprecedented, outrageous, and I think deeply unconstitutional scheme that would then, backfire on conservatives, Republicans next time the roles were reversed. If that is, it were to succeed, I think it's most likely that you would have months of intense litigation when one of these unlawfully appointed recess appointees exercised authority, say, to fire someone in DOJ. The DOJ official could sue and could, among other things, challenge the authority of the Attorney General. And I think it's quite likely you'd end up with the Supreme Court sharply limiting the president's recess appointment authority. I'll take just a minute on this, if I may. But back in 2014, the court, in a case called NLRB v. Noel Canning, ruled that President Obama's recess appointees to the NLRB were unlawful. The court agreed 9-0 on that result, but it sharply divided on its reasoning. You had a 5-justice majority, an opinion by Justice Breyer, saying that the recess appointment authority can be exercised during intra-session recesses, that is, breaks in the middle of a Senate session, and can be exercised with respect to vacancies that arose before the recess occurred. Justice Scalia, joined, it's important to note, by the Chief Justice, Justice Alito, and Justice Thomas, said, no, you're wrong on these two things. The president does not have such broad recess appointment authority. And I think there were lots of criticism of Justice Breyer's opinion back then, including his invention of a 10-day recess period that would be needed for recess appointments, to basically put on top of this jerry-rigged scheme he had. But I think when you look at the fact that those 3 justices are still on the court and have been joined by 3 other justices who I think are very likely to share Justice Scalia's view, one positive outcome if this outrageous approach were to be pursued is, I think it's very likely you'd have the Supreme Court adopting Justice Scalia's approach and saying, no, intra-session recess appointments are not permitted, and this authority can only be exercised with respect to vacancies that arose during the recess. And this is important, again, because what we're talking about in this scheme, the Senate comes into session on January 3rd, so you'd be talking about an intra-session recess, and most or all of the appointments would be to positions that were vacant before the recess occurred.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a great, not only a great summary of kind of where we are. I appreciate you bringing up the Supreme Court case, and we might have a chance to touch on that again in a second about how, if we were to see litigation in a subsequent administration, what might change on that front. But before we get there, James, I want to give you a chance to respond both broadly to the comments that Ed provided, but also if you could touch on, in the midst of your comments, whether this proposal for recess appointments would even be faster than the regular order of putting folks forward.
Yeah, Ed points out this case, the Supreme Court case, and I think it's instructive to remember that conservatives were up in arms and furious over President Obama doing this with National Labor Relations Board nominees. And now the assumption is that maybe Trump should use the recess appointment power, however that manifests itself, should use it to populate an entire cabinet. I think that's a very interesting dynamic, and I think it speaks to a lot of the dysfunction in our politics today, which is that we see Congress, we see the government as a factory that's charged with building things, and whatever it takes to get that thing is good, and whatever stands in our way is bad. And we rationalize away the various structures and rules that are absolutely critical to get there, for this whole thing to work. We saw this before with conservatives and Democratic opposition to judges. This is something that, and I'm in 100% agreement with Ed on this, on the recess appointment thing. Ed and I have, sparred intellectually in the past on judges, but it's the same thing. I mean, when we start to rationalize our kind of our position on certain rules that we find convenient or inconvenient, and we based on the outcome, we in essence kind of undermine our ability to do kind of self-government. Look, we don't, and we all, with that being said, I don't think we need to, the courts. I mean, this is common sense. Look at the Declaration. The Crown dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly. Governor Dunmore in Virginia dissolved the House of Burgesses. This is where Jefferson and Madison meet for the first time at the Raleigh Tavern. If you go to Colonial Williamsburg with your family on vacation, you can go have lunch there and drink like a Coca-Cola at probably the table near where they met for the first time. George Washington calls it like tyranny. He's very circumspect, and he is outraged by this action, right? It's in the Declaration of Independence. Tyrants dissolve people's assemblies, right? Parliament is not good because it worked with the king to dissolve the assemblies. So, I mean, the idea that somehow we want the president to have the ability to dissolve an assembly of our choosing against our will stands counter to the very notion of American independence and the American founding. Not only that, but the whole idea that somehow the ability to make appointments to office is something that is irrevocably an executive power, and executive power alone stands in stark contrast to our own history. The vast majority of the first state constitutions all gave the appointment power to the assembly. To the extent that the governor played any role whatsoever, it was as a part in that process. Right? If we look at the first, the Federal Convention, up until the very end, it was the Senate, or maybe at the very beginning, the Congress, but the Senate that had the ability to pick judges. It was the Senate that had the ability to nominate officials. The president didn't get that until the end, when all of a sudden the delegate said, whoa, we might have made the Senate too powerful, right? Too powerful. So I think just like common sense just shows us, and our own history shows us, that using this power in this way is completely at odds with our own development, our own founding. And then finally, I would just point out, this isn't a problem, because if the president has the votes to recess the Senate in the Senate, he's got the votes to confirm the nominees. You don't need to recess. And if he doesn't have the votes to recess the Senate, then they can't use this power, because there's no way to forcibly adjourn the Senate. Look, the Constitution is very clear. It says you have to be in a state of disagreement. In cases of disagreement, the president can, over the time of adjournment, the president can adjourn the two houses. Well, that's a very specific thing. The Senate is 100 people. It can't have an opinion on something until they decide to have an opinion. Non-action doesn't equal an opinion, right? And so if the House passes an adjournment resolution, we have rules and motions and procedures in the Senate that go back to 1789 that speak to what happens when to produce a disagreement. That is, the House takes the adjournment resolution, it sends it to the Senate picks it up and says, we don't want to do this. And then they vote to change the time that the House said they wanted to adjourn to. Then they send that back to the House. We're still not even in a state of disagreement, incidentally, because the House could take that resolution and just pass it, and then boom, they're done. Or the House could say, you know what, we disagree. And then they vote to disagree and insist on theirs, and then that sets up a procedure to kind of resolve those differences. At that point, they would be in a state of disagreement. If we acknowledge that non-action is a state of disagreement, just in terms of common sense, well, what time, at what point does non-action equal disagreement? Is it a minute? Is it 5 minutes? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it a year? It's laughable. It's nonsensical to suggest that somehow the Senate doing nothing means that now the Senate has done something, right? Because again, they can't have an opinion. As far as the time it goes, look, if you take the Supreme Court's 10-day period, and you assume that when the president comes in on day one, on January 20th, immediately the Senate recesses. Then 10 days later, on the 30th, then the president could presumably make some recess appointments. As Ed pointed out earlier, the Senate can get started now informally. And then when Republicans are in charge of the committees in January, on January 3rd, they can actually have these hearings so that once the president takes the oath of office, then turns around, walks into the Capitol before lunch, sits down in the president's room and signs all of the things that the president signs, and then nominates all these individuals and then sends them to the Senate. The Senate then can get busy under their own rules to immediately report those individuals. And if there are committee rules like the Judiciary Committee that requires them to wait 7 days, they can either wait 7 days or they could change those rules because they have a majority of the committee. And then they could hit the floor. And yes, there's a 30-hour time period. And yes, voting for cloture takes time. But if, not to get too complicated, if you file 8 cloture motions in a row, there's only 1 intervening day. There's not 8 intervening days. And then after that, the cloture motions ripen automatically. And while, yes, there is a 30-hour time limit, if you force Democrats to run the clock overnight, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then most importantly, over the weekend, guess what? They're going to do it for like a day and a half, maybe 2, and then they're going to stop because they see the outcome. They see that we're going to confirm these nominees anyway. If we're not, then maybe it's a different story, but that's a different problem. As Chris Murphy said, he's exhausted. They're not going to want to do this. So again, I think if the Republicans are serious and the president is serious about getting his team in place as quickly as possible, you could get it in place, it seems to me, well before, or at least before you could with recess appointments. You would avoid any kind of controversy. You would avoid any kind of political hit. And then they would be in office for the entirety of the president's administration if he so chose.
So that's okay. So that's helpful then. And I feel like it illuminates something that hasn't really been present in the national discourse around this, which is the normal flow of affairs very well could be and should be faster than any kind of rigged up recess appointment scheme. Ed, I want to turn to you in a second. You can have a chance to respond to some of what James has said if you have some things. But I think along the way too, I'm curious then, from what I'm gathering from this conversation, it would be faster potentially to run things through the normal process, and that the Congress would have to be complicit in some sort of recess appointment scheme, putting them on the political hook for what would happen here. As I'm seeing it, there's no real incentive structure to running this through recess appointments. And as you referenced before, some sort of recess appointment scheme might trigger litigation and challenges in the aftermath, as opposed to the traditional structure that is, it's how things are supposed to work. And even if someone might disagree with who that newly confirmed cabinet member is, they're now the cabinet member. Absent running through impeachment and removal, they will remain in that position. So I'm curious from your view, again, both opening up if you've got comments to what James shared, but also in your view, what really would be an incentive for this recess appointment scheme?
Well, I have one disagreement with James on timing. I think it's a small point in a larger picture, but under the recess appointment scheme, you don't wait till the end of the recess. You recess appoint right away. So you can have blanket recess appointments under the scheme on January 20th itself. So in theory, this would be faster. You could president could sign 300 different recess appointments. So the case against this is not based on the alternative being at least as fast. Look, this process exists for a reason. Look, I very much want Donald Trump to succeed as president, not just in the area that I care so much about, judges or national security, a whole host of other areas. Frankly, he gets a lot of bad advice from folks, and it's good to have some constraints that guide him towards making good picks. We've seen that already with his abandonment of the selection of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. But also, again, another problem with this approach is I think it would be flatly unconstitutional if it's done through this House mechanism that I described. And I think, I can't imagine the senators agreeing to recess on their own. It'd just be a shameful act. But again, if it were to succeed, you would have months of litigation that I think would end up resulting in the invalidation of these recess appointments. You'd setback, that'd be a huge setback for the administration. I agree with James that inaction cannot give rise to disagreement. Of course, the question is whether Donald Trump might contend otherwise. and go ahead and purport to make recess appointments. I also emphasize, I believe that, even if he had the authority to adjourn both houses, that even if a genuine case of disagreement arose, as I've explained, I don't think one would, the House can come back into session whenever it wants. Indeed, that's a core proposition in the Noel Canning case, that the Senate is able to say when it's in session, when it's not. And so it would be, for the reasons James has indicated, it would be beyond bizarre to think that the president's ministerial authority to adjourn in case of disagreement would enable him to keep either house from being in session, say during all of 2025. Inconceivable. So this is a scheme that I think is doomed to fail one way or another. And I'm encouraged that, especially with the demise of the Matt Gaetz nomination, for which the scheme seems to have been designed, it has perhaps been abandoned. Though you never know when a bad idea might get revived.
And hey, Matt, real quick, and again, I think Ed would agree with this too. It's important for our viewers the recess appointment power is a real power, right? The president has that power, and it is completely legitimate to use that power. I think the question is, when is it, when are you able to use it, right? And so I think the scheme association is with this idea of somehow a president unilaterally manufacturing a recess so that the president could unilaterally then decide to use the recess appointment power to circumvent the regular appointments process in the Constitution. So I think that's the part, because it is not illegitimate to use the recess appointment power. And Ed, I don't know, maybe I misread the Supreme Court case, but my understanding was that the court said, and again, it's not just the court that enforces this stuff, right? The Congress has plenty of tools at their own disposal to rein in an executive that does something like this. But at the end of the day, the court did say, though, that the Senate that there was a 10-day period, right, before the recess appointment power becomes operative. And it seems to me that with the inauguration and the Senate coming into session for the inauguration, that would then start the 10-day clock if they immediately adjourned right after that. And so it would not be until the 30th until they could make recess appointments, because the recess will not have been long enough.
No,
but I don't know. Is that not how it works in practice? I don't know.
No, there are two things getting mixed there. So under Breyer's opinion, you need to have a declared recess of at least 10 days in order for the recess appointment authority presumptively to operate. But if the Senate say on August 1 says we're adjourning till September 1, the president right away says, hey, I have a recess of more than 10 days. I can make my recess appointments now. He needs to make his appointments during the recess, and he can do so right away, so long as the recess is declared to be one of more than 10 days. Now, in my example, what happens if the Senate on August 1 says we're going into recess for 30 days, then 3 days later there's some sort of national emergency and it comes back in? I think the answer to that would be there was a declared recess of more than 10 days. The president can exercise his recess appointment while the Senate's out of session. And so any recess appointments he makes in that time, again, assuming that intersession recess appointments are constitutional, are valid. I appreciate your emphasizing that you and I recognize the validity of recess appointments. So often the straw man is, well, Reagan, made 200 plus recess appointments. Fine, a lot of these on very low level offices where the confirmation process had been pursued. Nothing at all comparable to a blanket appointment of cabinet officers at the beginning of a presidency. So yeah, I'm glad you clarified that point.
I do want to follow up on that case, Ed, because you bring up not only the 10 days window that's baked into that, but this idea, I think, that was in dispute in the case about whether the vacancy itself needed to arise during the recess. If you can, again, kind of touch on what the current state of the law is and whether or not that particular provision would be applicable in this kind of circumstance. Would the president need to ask that person he elevated for that interim status to function, say, as AG, to step down to create the vacancy? Can a president create a vacancy that he then needs to fill in order to trigger that recess appointments power?
Oh, I think a president can create a vacancy. He can remove an officer, and at that point, the position is vacant. A position is vacant even when an acting officer is exercising the authority of it. So there's always going to be someone exercising that authority, but it's vacant if you don't have for those offices that require a presidential appointment, if you don't have a presidential appointee operating in the office. So let me go back then to the two core issues that divided the 9 justices in Noel Canning. And I should have the text of the recessive appointment clause in front of me. I don't have it exact here, but it says basically that the president may make recess appointments when the Senate. I should get this exact language. For vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. That's the key language.
That's right. I'm happy to chip in if it's helpful, Ed, for our audience's purposes. It's the president shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session.
Okay, so one question is, what is the recess of the Senate? Is the recess of the Senate, does that mean only an intersession recess? That is a recess between 2 formal sessions of the Senate. And the second question is, when can it be said that a vacancy happens during the recess? Must the vacancy itself first arise during the recess, or does it happen during the recess if it pre-existed and continues into the recess? So on both these points, Justice Breyer's majority opinion took the more expansive view of presidential authority, said that the president may make recesses during intra-session recesses, and also that authority may be exercised with respect to vacancies that pre-existed the recess. Justice Scalia vigorously disagreed on both points. I think that there's a pretty strong consensus of constitutional scholars that Justice Scalia got it right. But then what Breyer did as well is he then glommed onto these rules he was creating. He said, but we're not saying that a recess of 1 second or 3 days is enough. Instead, we're going to say, both with respect to intersession recesses and intrasession recesses, that as a presumptive matter, whatever that means, who knows what it takes to overcome the presumption, you need to have a recess of at least 10 days before the recess appointment authority can be exercised. Scalia obviously did not have to reach that issue and ridiculed Breyer for inventing this 10-day rule. Under Justice Scalia's approach, an intersession recess, no matter how short, suffices for the recess appointment authority to be exercised, but only in intersession recess and only with respect to vacancies that arise during that recess.
That's helpful. Thank you. And James, I'll give you a moment here to provide some reply, but I'm also curious if you can, as we start to wrap up our conversation today as well, as we head into this holiday season, folks are looking into 2025, Hill watchers and those who are connected into American politics are looking forward to, what might come in the new Congress and what might come in the new administration. How much actual kind of mental effort should we be putting into the scheme by which these vacancies are filled? Is this really much ado about nothing, and that ultimately we're probably going to see the Senate consider nominees, and under the normal process, or is there really momentum building for some sort of recess appointments scheme that again, I use this phrase scheme, as you pointed out, not to imply that recess appointments themselves are a problem, but that this approach toward it seems to be an attempt to circumvent the standard process. How much brain power should we really even be putting into this discussion?
Well, I'll say all the brain power. I mean, no, because we're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about how, the foundations of our system and how the branches ought to operate. We're recognizing that there are different branches. All that stuff is always good, right? So I think that's, in that sense, there's a kind of silver lining here. I think what we need to keep in mind, though, is that, the president has people who have concerns about the president are entirely justified, and people who have concerns about the people who have concerns about the president are also justified. I think we we need to recognize that people, the interest in this speaks to the very real concern on both sides surrounding this presidency and the hope or the fear for the future. And those things, I think, need to be taken serious. But I will say that, look, the president has a lot of tools at his disposal. If you're a big fan of President Trump and want his team in place, whoever that may be, the president has lots of tools that he can use, including the bully pulpit. And then coupled with a majority in the Senate, and especially as Ed has pointed out, now that there's no ability to kind of filibuster. And even then, I would say that ability to filibuster was never that big of a threat because it's never really derailed nominees to the same degree. But ultimately, this is it's a solution in search of a problem, in my opinion. I mean, the president's going to get his picks. Maybe he doesn't get them all. No president or most presidents don't. And the picks that the president doesn't get, is that the end of the world for the president? Of course not. And if you don't like the president, does that mean that you can sleep easy at night? Of course not. Because these are it's just the start of the process. In politics, it's just a process that plays out over time and it never ends. And so, the confirmation is just a proxy battle for all of the debates and fights that are going to come after that. And even then, I would just try to reassure everybody that there's a lot more kind of muddle and disagreement within each camp on either side than there is between them, as we often think. And so, it's going to be uncertain. That's the case. That's the price we pay to govern ourselves. And whoever works hard is going to ultimately get more of what they want in the end, and whoever doesn't isn't. And then the last thing I'll say is that you have to have the American people on your side, when it's all said and done. And the way that plays out is that you have a process that forces each side to make a case, and then the American people will ultimately weigh in. And I think after this last election, I'm not sure that President Trump and his supporters in Congress should be worried about that. I think that the American people, maybe not, mandate something completely different, but ultimately the extent of his victory and the extent of popular concern on issues like immigration and other things, I think speaks to the fact that the president doesn't need to come up with these convoluted workarounds to ultimately get his team in place and try to do what he said he was going to do in the election.
Thanks, James. Ed, I want to turn to you for a last word here. Both on the front of in your mind, is this something we should be deeply worried about as an American people as we're watching this process? And also, if you want to touch on, what really we should be watching for in the course of presidential nominations and confirmation. What's going on during the season? There are lessons that we should be prepared to take away from this experience.
Well, I would like to think that this recess appointment scheme is a terrible idea that has been killed. So I'd like to think that we don't have to worry about it too much going forward. But I think it's very important that folks spoke out about it when they did. And what's disturbing is how few folks spoke out about it. I think lots of folks were, I think this applies to senators, intimidated by some of Donald Trump's most vocal supporters. It is shocking that there's a senator who ran for majority leader who seemed to be all in on this idea. It's shocking that Speaker of the House Mike Johnson seemed to have been willing to entertain it. So I hope it does not rise again. I don't expect to be worrying about it over the Christmas holiday, but in part that's because I think we have exposed what an awful idea it is, and I think it would be difficult, given the very tight margin in the House, for President Trump to pursue the scheme by which the House itself votes to adjourn. I can't imagine that there'd be the votes in the Senate to adjourn. So I hope it doesn't happen. But it's such an outrageous idea, and one that so fundamentally misconceives the important role of the Senate in the appointment process that I think it was essential to highlight up front. Look, as we go forward with these nominations, one question obviously is going to be: are we getting quality folks being placed in charge of these departments? And I think the value of simple competence perhaps is being underestimated by a lot of people. I mean, if you actually care about reforming these institutions, you need to have some real competence to do it. It's not enough to go on TV and rant about burning the place down. That's going to achieve nothing. but I'll also look to see whether there are significant deviations from standard Senate procedure that will come back to haunt us when the roles are reversed next time around.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I guess thank you, Ed, specifically. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. With this, we'll start to wrap up. I'll say that I found this discussion to be incredibly illuminating. I feel now more prepared to watch the formal nomination and confirmation process and have a little better context for what to expect. Hopefully, everyone else who joined us today for the discussion agrees. As a reminder for our participants, this event was recorded, so if you missed part of it, it will be available afterward. But with that, happy holidays to all, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.